Today on Data Radicals, I'm joined by Jeremy Kahn, AI editor at Fortune, where he is spearheading the publication's coverage of artificial intelligence. Prior to Fortune, he spent 8 years at Bloomberg as a technology reporter and a senior writer for Bloomberg Markets magazine. Jeremy's work has been featured in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, Newsweek, The Atlantic, Smithsonian, the Boston Globe, and Portfolio. He is also the author of Mastering AI, a survival guide to our superpowered future, and he is the lead author of Fortune's Eye on AI newsletter. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So why don't we jump right into the book? You obviously just most recently wrote it. What's the book about? Why'd you write it?
Yeah, so the book, which is called Mastering AI, is I wrote it to be a primer sort of for a non-technical audience to try to explain how we kind of arrived at this moment with AI and where this technology is likely taking us. I wanted to explain, sort of how we got here and to get a sense, give readers a sense of what the future might hold, and how AI, I think, is going to have all kinds of impacts, both positive and potentially negative, on our lives and our thinking, on the way we work, the way industries are organized, and on society sort of writ large.
And as you've written the book, and as we reviewed it, you have some. You seem like you're leaning into the idea that this can be a massively transformational technology, where you talk about potential to unravel social fabric, jeopardize democracy. Can you sort of illustrate for us how some of those scenarios would play out? Maybe even both positive and negative, but tell us sort of what is that? Give us an image for what that future looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a tremendously transformative technology, and I think there's some really big positive effects. Particularly, I think we are going to see a huge uplift in labor productivity, and I don't think we're going to see sort of mass joblessness from this technology. I think actually this is a technology that could enable people to sort of be lifted back up into the middle class. And one of the ways that would work is if you're able to create a whole series of AI copilots for knowledge work that are designed to help professionals complete certain professional tasks, things that they would do in their job, copilot for lawyers, a copilot for accountants, a copilot for people who work in banking, for financial advisors. I think what you're going to see is that there are people who have less training and less experience and may not have the academic credentialing that's currently necessary to work in these professions, be able to enter these professions with the help of an AI copilot. The example I like to use here is sort of with accounting, where currently we do not have enough trained accountants in the U.S. There's a huge crisis of particularly for public company accountants, and their states are considering lowering kind of certification standards to deal with this already. And there's just a huge lack of people to go into the profession. But I think what you can do is potentially take people who have a 2-year associate's degree in bookkeeping, and with an AI copilot, potentially upskill them to the point where they could take on some of the public company accounting work that needs to be done. And I think it's true across most of the professions and a lot of knowledge work that the issue is not that we have too many people. The issue is that we simply do not have enough people actually in these professions. And at the same time, we have a lot of people who were squeezed out of the middle class in past decades, who used to have good jobs sort of in manufacturing or sort of lower level service sector jobs, who've been pushed out and often have ended up in retail and hospitality work, which is less secure and tends to pay less well. But I think some of those people, with the help of AI copilots, can upskill and sort of climb their way back into the middle class, which I think would be a hugely positive effect. So that's like one of the hugely positive impacts. You mentioned about the threat to democracy. So I do think there's a risk from this technology to democracy. And that comes largely through the ability for the technology to supercharge kind of misinformation and disinformation campaigns. There's it's just easier to create at great scale misinformation content that is potentially more convincing. I'm also quite concerned about the use of chatbots potentially in the political sphere, because we're finding that that chatbots are incredibly persuasive, and that could be a tool for both good or, in the wrong hands, really bad purposes. And I worry about how politicians may start to use these AI chatbots, particularly if we allow in the future, for instance, any advertiser to potentially shape what it is that people are receiving when they ask questions of a chatbot. I think we need to be very careful of any business models that would allow that to happen, or at least if we do allow advertising to kind of influence the responses that chatbots give, that should be completely transparent, that there's been that advertising relationship. And I certainly worry about that in the political sphere. If the Democratic Party or the Republican Party can pay money to OpenAI or to Google, and in order to get chatbot responses to political questions shaped a certain way, I think that's potentially very dangerous, and could help undermine democracy to some degree. Obviously, the use of deepfake technology, increasingly convincing synthetic media of various kinds, and voice deepfakes as well, is really problematic. I think it's going to be very hard for people to tell what is authentic and what is inauthentic, and it's going to be very difficult for, I think, news media and fact-checking organizations to keep pace with potentially the volume of false content, which you might see.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there's a little bit of a contradiction, right? Because on one hand, you've got sort of this upskilling of these folks who, in the auditing example, or maybe in a medical example, have the ability to leverage these bots and these agents in order to be able to do their work. But a lot of what comes from in the long tail of training from year 2 to year 7, if you're a physician, is discernment. Your ability to be able to sort of look at a body of information and say, that particular thing is off. It may not be right. And yet, in many of these other examples, deepfakes and the like, you also are sort of almost playing into people's inability to be able to discern. And it strikes me that the big question is sort of this question of like, how will people know what is true? And in some cases, like, and that can work in both directions. It can work in the direction of maybe being useful because people are empowered, but also maybe being horrible because people won't have the discernment, if you're an auditor that hasn't had the appropriate training in knowing when to dive in deeper into some financials that otherwise might look fishy.
Yeah, and I think again, I think we're going to have to be careful in how we train and create such systems. I'm by the way, I'm very much think that the way this is going to go, and I think it will be better for us if it does go this way, is that we have copilots that are not generalist systems necessarily, but which are actually they might have a general LLM kind of at the heart of them, but that will have had essentially quite a lot of potentially other models appended to them, quite a lot of front end architecture, so that they are really designed to answer questions specifically for people in that profession and to really help them, those particular professionals. So I don't think, the chatbot that we have for medicine to help a doctor, that copilot, I don't think that should be the same copilot that's going to help an accountant. I think those should be actually different systems, even if at the heart of them they use the same model. I think there should be quite a lot of different architecture around that to try to shape the responses. And one of the things it could do is say, is to actually have that capture a lot of that what's often called sort of tacit knowledge that experts have. I think through the fine tuning of these systems, there will be ways to kind of capture a lot of that tacit knowledge and actually have copilot systems that are able to relay that to a person who's less of an expert, and will be able to coach them as they would be coached by someone who is much more experienced in that field. Yes, it's true that a lot of sort of professional discernment is tacit knowledge. People often, the practitioners themselves, can't actually quite articulate what it is that led them to think that doesn't quite look right, or that something's off here, or in this particular circumstance, it's better if we don't use this particular argument with this judge. If you're a lawyer, but I really think the systems will eventually be able to capture that knowledge and will be able to sort of present that discernment to folks. On the other hand, I do think we need to continue to teach critical thinking. I think, schools from primary school onwards should be teaching people that they have to think critically about the information they're receiving. What is the source of that information? And, can it be trusted? And I think we're going to also, certainly in the medical context, perhaps in other fields too, I really think we need realistic validation of Copilot systems. And I'm, as I mentioned in the book, when it comes to systems that are designed to help doctors, I'm concerned about systems that are not that we're already approving. The FDA's sort of approval system does not necessarily force these vendors to show that there's actually kind of clinical effectiveness of these systems. Often they can get a system approved based on some testing on historical data, but you don't have to necessarily prove that your system in the clinic is going to improve patient outcomes. And I think it'd be much better if the standard was, does it improve patient outcomes? And I think with these other copilots, a similar kind of standard of like, does it actually produce better work across the board for people, not just, can it pass the CPA exam, for instance? I want to see that, studies that actually show people working alongside these systems, are they actually both more productive, but also is the critical standards for in the case of an accountant, maybe detecting fraud, met. And of course, if it's not, I think that's a problem. And we should hold the vendors to those kind of standards.
Yeah, I guess the question then becomes who does that work and who determines what the outcomes are. I mean, in the medical case, I mean, we I now go to the doctor. What I often find is that the doctor is super incentivized to sort of move very quickly on from my visit because they have 15 more visits behind me. They often will even claim things in notes that didn't actually occur. So, they'll say, oh, I did this and this and this with the patient and I advised them of this. And I'm like, that really never happened. And what you see, I think, in that is, the invisible sort of insurance company who's basically saying, look, we will pay you X for a dollar, like per visit. And so in that case, the question is, what's the outcome? Like, is the outcome a successful, negative payout for the insurance company? Is the outcome long-term sort of health of the patient? Is the outcome that the person doesn't come back and report a similar, sort of finding? That all is sort of messy work. And you could see a world in which the complexity defaults to whoever has the money and whoever has the power. How do you think about that? Is there a role for regulation, or
yeah,
I think
I think there's definitely a role for regulation. And I think we need some policing of business models that might create incentives that for systems that would not function as in the public interest. And I think ultimately government's going to have to play some role. But I do think also there's industry standards that might work for specific copilots for specific industries. I think the industry should set a standard. And I don't think any of these professions have an interest necessarily in a degradation of standards, even if there are certain financial incentives right now that work. Doctors may, in practice, be doing certain things, as you suggest, in order to be able to bill more from the insurance companies. But I think if you went to any medical standard setting body and said, is that appropriate practice, they would say no. So I think we can kind of rely on some of these professional standard setting bodies to potentially do some of this work and set standards for, well, what do we want out of these Copilot systems?
Yeah. And how do you see that regulation evolving in practice? I mean, there's the EU AI Act, and they're obviously very quick to legislate. It seems like the United States is the literal exact opposite, where we just, either have no will or no desire or both. What do you see as the evolution of this? Will it come from Europe? Will it come from some other jurisdiction? Will it come from the internal community?
Yeah, I think it's going to come from a couple places. I do think, again, when you talk about knowledge workers, to the extent there are professional bodies, they themselves may play a role in this. But yeah, the EU AI Act is a great example. I don't know that the EU got it exactly right. I think there, people who say that the EU AI Act is going to be too onerous on small businesses may have a point. But in general, if you look at the Act and some of its sort of high level principles, I think they were very sensible ones, which is you should take a risk-based approach. It should be a lot about deployment use cases, except when the model is so general that you have to do something about the model itself. But a lot of that Act is designed to look at use cases and designed to affect the company that's deploying the technology, not necessarily the technology vendor. It puts the onus on the company deploying the technology to have done certain things to make sure that however they're using that system in practice, what is the risk of how they're using that system? What steps have they done to assess those risks? If those are deemed to be sort of high risk categories, what have they done to mitigate those risks? I think that's all very sensible. And I think you may see, because Europe is a relatively large market, that companies will adopt this as a kind of de facto standard, as they have with Europe's GDPR privacy standard, where it's kind of become a de facto global standard. But I don't know. We'll see, because also you already see the example of some of the AI vendors saying that they're not going to roll out some of the product features that they have already announced that they're rolling out in the US, in Europe, because they're concerned about how they're going to comply with this act. And I think so it's possible that some companies will say, actually, yeah, we can do without Europe, and then it'll be kind of an interesting thing to see what happens. Might get quite a fractured landscape or marketplace for these systems. In the US, it's a big problem because, the question is I think people are very interested, politicians are very interested in doing something. The question is what, and can they agree on something to get out, actually pass legislation. And I think it should happen at the federal level. There's just been an effort, in California to pass laws independently that would affect a lot of the companies based there. And I think in the US, we have this issue where the states are starting to take action because of the lack of action by the federal government. So, and I think that's problematic. I don't think you want a system where you have every state with its own AI Act and different laws to comply with in every state. So I do think we need to have some action at the federal level. When we're going to see that happen, I don't know, because there has been a lot of, lack of will. And even though there were some bipartisan efforts in Congress that looked like they were maybe going to pay off last year, and I think there's some agreement on both sides of the aisle that there should be some rules and regulation passed around AI. I think, there's going to be quite a lot of debate about what the specifics should be. And so far, nothing's actually come forward. But we'll see what happens. I'm pretty convinced that we will see at some point in the next few years government action. It may be that the U.S. is behind other countries, though.
Yeah, and the shape of that, I think, could be pretty variable and could have a lot of different impacts. Newsom just vetoed SB, I think it was SB 1047. That was a particularly, certainly in speaking to other entrepreneurs that are in the AI landscape, there was a lot of negativity from the entrepreneurial community around that, because there was some, I think, form of personal liability that would have been enforced. How do you feel about that? I mean, what's the general, reaction based upon others that you've spoken to about that regulation? And do you think it should have passed?
Yeah, I think SB 1047 was not a bad piece of legislation, actually. I think it sort of made a lot of sense. It was trying to head off what, the most catastrophic risks. A lot of the provisions of the law would only take effect on an incident that caused more than $500 million worth of damages. So you're talking about pretty catastrophic effects. And there was also a model size threshold in that proposed law, which would have meant that a lot of smaller models would have been below that threshold and that would have had no effect on them. I think the concern people had with that, though, was twofold. Yes, you mentioned the personal liability. So a lot of people were upset that it wasn't just the companies that would be on the hook, but actually there would be personal liability, including criminal liability, for individuals at the companies if they were shown not to have taken appropriate steps to try to assess and mitigate risks, and then there was an incident that caused that kind of damage. I think the particular concern was over open source AI systems, because the open source community said, hey, we can take reasonable steps to do safety assessments and to put in some guardrails, but once we kind of put this out there in the world, we have no idea what a user was going to do with it, and what if they modify the system and something goes wrong? Am I going to be criminally liable for that? The other problem I think people had was it was not clear what happened with fine tuning. So if you took a large language model from even one of the proprietary providers, but you fine tune that model and then deployed it in your business, and something went wrong, the question was, well, who's liable then? Is the company that did the fine tuning going to be subject to these strict liability rules? And there was a reasonable interpretation of people that yes, they would be, and I'm not sure that was really the intent of the people who drafted the law. And I'm not sure that's really fair, particularly if the problem, it turns out, it actually has to do with the initial training of the model and the initial architecting of the model. I'm not sure it's fair to hold a company that essentially buys that model and then fine tunes it liable for what happens. So I don't know. It wasn't a perfect piece of legislation, but I think it was sort of a step in the right direction. And I think it had like on a principle based level, got a lot of things right. It was kind of, it was a reasonable step, I would have thought. But yes, I mean, it's been vetoed now. And the only thing I think which was really unreasonable about it, is that it was California acting alone. Again, I think it doesn't really make sense to have 50 states each with their own AI Act. I think we really want this to be done at the federal level. That makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, but it seems consistent. I mean, the privacy example that you used with GDPR seemed to flow through to first California, and now there are some states popping up, following California's example. And so it does seem, and it seems like many of the red states are far more interested in sort of lagging on sort of regulatory apparatus, which by default means that then the blue states like California tend to be the ones that lead.
Yeah.
One of the problems with these bits of legislation, though, are that the complexity in these corner cases often are what kill what, if 87% of the bill is great or 85% of the bill is great, you have this, residual 15% where all the details are being worked out, but, sort of really thinking through personal liability, causality, complexity, who's liable, is it the fine tuning example? How do we know whether the particular form of fine tuning influenced the model inordinately? I mean, these are hard questions, and you could see a world in which it's going to, I mean, even as the technology evolves, it's going to take us a ton of time to evolve because we don't really understand causality with these models. How do you think about that? I mean, do you feel like we will get to an answer, or do you feel like this could just, I don't know, like what? I mean, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think we need a kind of flexible approach to legislation. Just as we need it is a nascent technology, and I think we have to be prepared to act now but iterate later. And generally that's not been a way that a lot of lawmaking works, particularly at the federal level, actually, because it's often very hard to change things, although slightly better at the federal rulemaking level. So it might be something where the best law we could pass at the federal level would be one that sort of defers a lot of the details to an agency, which can then take on expert advice. And there can be a process by which the regulations or the implementing regulations are adjusted over time, as we figure out what works and what doesn't work, and where do we get this right or wrong, without having to go back to Congress to pass a new law. Because I think that that's a really lengthy process and a really fraught process, and we probably don't want to have that. But we probably want some sort of law that establishes some general principles and then hands it off to a federal agency to work out the details through a rulemaking process that's more flexible.
How much do you think the election will impact this regulatory apparatus? Like given sort of the
hugely, basically, I think it's going to have I think it's going to have a huge impact. I mean, you've already had the Republican camp say that if Trump is elected, they're going to right away sort of cancel the Biden administration's executive order on AI, which is the only little bit of federal regulation that exists on AI. They've basically kind of fallen into this camp among the group that calls themselves effective accelerationists, where they're big fans of pushing this technology as far as possible, as fast as possible, and they really don't want any regulation. So I think you are going to see quite a lot of you wouldn't see very much regulation if you get a Trump administration, and I think they would be very opposed to regulation. The only thing I think you might get, which is kind of interesting, is at the same time you might see a federal effort actually to push the technology forward, where you might actually see the government get much more involved in funding a kind of Manhattan Project towards AGI, I only say this because I don't know if you saw over the last this is last weekend, but Ivanka Trump, tweeted out, went to X and posted that she was a big fan of this monograph that an ex OpenAI guy named Leopold Aschenbrenner has published, which is talking about sort of the race for superintelligence. And he really posits this as this U.S. versus China contest. And he sort of talks about the need for the U.S. to kind of get behind a Manhattan Project in order to beat China to AGI. And it sounds like there's people around Trump who think, oh, this is, they tend to view China as in this zero sum game, and that there's this new Cold War, and I think they want to win that new Cold War, and I think they're attracted to this idea of some sort of Manhattan Project to beat China to AGI. So that's interesting. I think that might be a difference. Whereas I think if you see Harris get elected, it's going to be a lot of continuation of what we've seen with Biden, which I think will be some efforts at regulation. I think there will be an extension of perhaps the executive order to cover more companies, or to go ask like the FTC to take more action. I think there also might be an effort with the support of the administration to introduce a sort of comprehensive bill into Congress. Whether that would pass, I think, would depend on the shape of Congress after this election. So yeah, I think they're less attracted to the idea of this kind of grand race for AGI. I think they also are concerned about what China's doing and concerned about the geopolitics of this, but I don't really see them getting behind a federally sponsored effort to kind of push the technology forward. So I think they think the private sector is doing a pretty good job already, and that there's no real need to have a taxpayer funded effort to build giant data centers or something. So I think there will be a big difference between a potential Harris administration and a future Trump administration. It'd be very interesting to see what happens. But yeah, I think the election's going to be pretty determinative.
Yeah, I can imagine that it would be. And you speak obviously to some of the major actors in the world of AI, and did so obviously as a part of the book, but also separately in your reporting. What are the attitudes like? How are people, how are the Altmans and the like feeling about all of this? There's obviously been a lot of reporting around OpenAI specifically in terms of how cavalier it has or has not been. It's becoming a commercial company as opposed to a nonprofit. You can talk about OpenAI specifically or not, but I think just the question of where is the general tech zeitgeist? Is this one of the reasons why it's more in the Republican Trump camp, or how do you see this? How do you see people's feelings around this?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think if you talk to a lot of people at the leading AI labs, they actually generally will tell you they're in favor of regulation, that they actually think that there should be some kind of federal rulemaking around this. A lot of them are in favor of an AI agency specifically to look into this technology. They're in this weird position where they kind of know they're in this competitive race, and they're actually kind of looking for some outside force to come in and actually kind of intervene in those dynamics and set some ground rules. And I think they don't feel they can do it themselves. And I think they get a lot. So Altman's interesting because he's gone before Congress and said, like, basically, please regulate us. I think this needs to be regulated. And then if you look at how they're lobbying as a company, they've lobbied against regulation, which is kind of interesting. But I actually think that that seems, a lot of people think, oh, you're such a hypocrite. But actually, I think it's more that they feel like, no, this is like, as a company, we have a fiduciary responsibility in some ways to keep pushing forward. But as individuals, we really wish that the government would step in. And it's like they kind of want a set of rules for all of them that will kind of, I think, maybe temper some of the extreme competitive dynamics that are pushing them kind of constantly forward on advancing models. I think almost, it really is one of these things where they're sort of begging the regulators to stop them from doing the thing that they're sort of committed to doing, which is, it's a really weird dynamic.
It's like the state of nature, like
Yeah.
the life is nasty, brutish, and short, and
Yeah.
everybody's sort of just hacking away at each other because it, But Altman in particular, I mean, OpenAI is obviously the primary player
Yeah.
in this game, and the strength of the primary player is sort of that the lack of rules accrues to probably that player more than any other.
Yeah.
You would think.
Yeah, I think that's true. But you see the same dynamic. I talked to Demis Hassabis at DeepMind, and it's kind of similar. I think he feels like there's a lot of pressure competitively to match what OpenAI is doing, but he kind of wishes that pressure weren't there, and if there were some rules around it, that wouldn't be a bad thing. And I feel like a lot of Dario Amodei, also at Anthropic, is kind of the same way. It's sort of like they're continuing to push forward all these models as fast as they can, and yet I think he kind of wishes that the government would do something.
Yeah. Although they've been, I'm probably amongst the group the most thoughtful about whatever ethical AI is and what it might look like, and investing in behind
Yeah,
explainability.
that's true. And the constitutional AI, which they've have helped develop, is a really interesting idea about how you would give a system guardrails. And yeah, no, they absolutely are more. They seem more committed genuinely to AI safety than some of the other labs.
Talk about constitutional AI. I mean, explain the concept, and where has it been, and talk about where it's been applied, and how it's been used, because I think it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah. So the idea is that you would give an AI system an actual written constitution, and it would have to assess its outputs before providing them against the written constitution and try to assess whether it had complied or not. And it turns out that this works relatively well, that actually having the model check its own output against a set of principles for compliance with those principles actually works, which is kind of weird. And I think you get into this, it becomes even more important if you start thinking about AI agents that can kind of take action in the world. Like, how are you going to make sure that they, follow human intentions writ large and don't take certain actions that we would not ever want them to take? And one of the ideas is, well, we'll just give it a written constitution that prohibits certain things and see if it can check its actions against that. Anthropic developed this. They wrote a constitution. They have used this as part of the training of Claude, their LLM, and it seems to work. Claude does seem actually less prone to jumping guardrails, less susceptible to prompt injection attacks than other systems, because it seems to always, check itself against this constitution. It's not 100%, it doesn't work 100%. It turns out, you can get Claude to do things it's not supposed to, but it's much harder than with some of the other systems. And it seems that this is a somewhat robust way of doing this. But then it raises this question of what is in the Constitution, and who gets to write the Constitution. Anthropic, when they first did this, Anthropic wrote the Constitution, but they realized that was kind of problematic. Like, if this is going to be the constitution of some future super powerful AI, is it right that a single company gets to write, construct this? So they actually did some polling of Americans to see, what principles would people want in a AI constitution. And it was interesting because there was unfortunately, people were pretty divided, as you might imagine, in America. So it turned out about 2/3 of people agreed on a set of general principles for what they wanted to see in an AI constitution and how they generally wanted AI outputs to be. But the other third, the problem was that the other third vehemently disagreed with the 2/3 about those principles, and the 1/3 was actually was much more libertarian. They really felt that they wanted, an AI system that would present information truthfully, irregardless of whether that was offensive to anyone, and that would not go out of its way to sort of tailor its answers to any particular group. They wanted essentially kind of a system that would weight freedom of opportunity and individual freedom against any particular group dynamics, whereas the other 2/3 were sort of interested in outputs that, for instance, wouldn't necessarily offend minority groups, or that would kind of take the collective more into account in providing answers, which was kind of interesting. And it does sort of show that, if you have a very divided country, then it's an issue about how are you going to write these constitutions. Also, if you have a product that you're going to roll out to lots of different parts of the world, that becomes an issue because, of course, certain cultures are more communitarian, some are more individualistic, and who gets to decide? I think is a really interesting question. And or could you have a system where people could individually provide a constitution to their own, LLM, or each user, could they provide their individual constitution to the system? I don't know. I mean, right now that's not how it works. It's just when the model's trained, it's given a particular constitution, a document to check things against. But potentially there'd be these other approaches, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the libertarian approach is obviously, super consistent with the crypto, like decentralized, the market's always efficient, information's always right view, which is like obviously an interesting perspective. This idea, though, of a constitution, so we'll try to link to that, by the way, in the show notes, along with SB 1047 for those folks who would love to do a little bit more research on that. Um, as you sort of think about regulation, though, you talked a little bit about this idea of copilots, and in fact, but there is this world in which job displacement does exist. In fact, I was talking to the CEO of an AI company that I know, and he was talking to a potential client who was very powerful and rich, billionaire, and this guy says to him, produce for me AI that literally, I want less people working here, and I just simply don't want to employ people. So produce for me AI that actually displaces jobs. And so there are people who are thinking this, and
absolutely there are.
And so in this world where, there are some them, less benevolent folks who are thinking these things, you have this idea of this kind of Pigouvian tax of sorts, where you would actually tax the AI using businesses that are displacing jobs. Tell us a little bit about that concept. And how
it's the idea of a robot tax, and it was an idea of like, how do you encourage businesses to think of this as a complementary technology to human labor and not just a substitute for human workers. And I think that's really essential, because a lot of the risks from this technology really come from the idea that it's going to directly replace humans in the workforce on a one-to-one basis. That a lot of the things that could go wrong with AI technology kind of assume that there's no longer a human in the loop on a lot of these systems, that it's not acting as a co-pilot, that it is kind of acting as an autopilot. So I think we want to do whatever we can to encourage businesses to think about this as something that is a co-pilot that's complementary to their workers, that can actually extend their abilities, potentially offer them a chance to do new things, move into new areas, not as something to just fire workers. So I was thinking about, how do you encourage that? And, some economists, of course, had come up with the idea of a robot tax. And I think what I was proposing was a kind of robot tax. But you want it to essentially hit firms that are clearly using automation to replace workers while also growing. So my idea was, if it would only affect firms that had their profits growing while at the same time, and which were deploying AI systems while at the same time firing workers. If a firm, that way you wouldn't penalize a company that was, a failing business that felt like it had to lay off workers anyway to save the business. They would not be subjected to this tax. But a company that was profitable and which was growing profits, but yet laying off its workers while deploying this technology would be affected. And it was just a simpler formulation. I mean, some of the economists I talked to had very complicated formulations for a robot tax, where you would actually have to figure out, the competitive advantage of the automation system versus people. And it just seemed like it would be very difficult for a tax agency to assess, whether that had happened or not. Whereas this was a fairly slightly cruder measure, but an easier one to use.
Yeah. But it sounds really hard, because I mean, if you displace people, it's hard to attribute directly back to the AI as being the sole reason for doing it.
No, well, that's why I was saying it wouldn't have to be that. It's just if you're deploying AI technology and you're firing people at the same time your profits are growing, I also, it would have to be mass layoffs. I'm not talking about firing an individual here or there. But yes, I mean, I did not in my formulation think that the tax authority was somehow going to have to figure out causation. And there'd sort of be this assumption that the people were losing their jobs due to automation. If you were, making a big effort at automation and continuing to grow the business, and yet shedding lots of workers.
Yeah, it's still hard, though. I mean, it's funny. My son has a sesame allergy, and one of the things that the Faster Act sort of advocated for was the premise that you would label every food that contains sesame. And so what interestingly happened was that all of the manufacturers basically, or not all of them, but many of them basically said, okay, we're just going to throw sesame flour into every single thing because we just don't want to have to deal with the idea of cleaning our lines.
Right.
And and so there were these like sort of negative, externalities
Yeah.
or from the event, and you could see something similar. But I certainly understand the intent, and I think the premise though that the idea of putting people out of work is a bad thing seems conceptually right to me, and like a bad sort of motivator in general. Do you feel so? I guess maybe just right now today, there's models. The recent Strawberry model came out from OpenAI. Where are we today? Where are we right now with these models? Like, what are the issues that we're contending with? Give us kind of the today blow by blow, and do you feel like there's sort of leveling off of the innovation curve, or do you feel like we're still in early innings and it's going to continue to accelerate pretty quickly?
Well, I definitely feel like we're still very early in this, and there's still lots of gains to be made. And I mean, I think O1 just kind of shows you that. I mean, that model, which OpenAI debuted, is much better at reasoning and kind of logic tasks and mathematics, but it has some drawbacks. Like it takes longer to provide an answer. It is more uses more computing power, and as a result, OpenAI is charging quite a lot more for tokens for that model than other models. It's also not fully integrated right now with the rest of kind of ChatGPT, which actually it really results in some stupid stuff like if you ask it a hard question and it provides a good response, and then you happen to absentmindedly type thanks, or tell the model thanks, it then does this again where it does a whole reasoning process about how it should respond to your thank you, which is completely wasteful and dumb. And what we really want is something that's going to kind of a model, where your question goes to a small model that assesses, which of the models is most likely to answer that question best, and then just feeds it to the most appropriate model. And I'm sure that's coming very soon. Yeah, I think the problem we have now with this technology is still, it's still a bit futsy to use. It isn't. It can be very hard to figure out what prompts are going to get you the best answer still. There's still quite, prompt engineering is still more sort of art than science right now, I'd say. And also, the hallucination rates, while they've come down, and techniques such as, retrieval augmented generation, RAG, and Google has this thing called retrieval interleaved generation, where they actually have several different steps of kind of retrieval and reasoning about the documentation that's been retrieved, and then generating off of that. These techniques have brought hallucination rates down considerably, but they're still not to nothing. I mean, there still is hallucination problems with the technology. And I think that's frustrated a lot of businesses, and they're not quite sure, where they can deploy this safely, and how to deploy it at scale. And I think that's why ultimately I think we will, solve a lot of these problems. And I do think all the sort of AI startups that are working on these specific industry copilots for law or for accounting or for medicine, and for other professions, architecture, I've heard of some, design, they will kind of solve some of these problems, because they actually will figure out, the kind of what are the right meta prompts to get the performance out of the model, and architect away some of this, so that it just becomes a much smoother process, where you can just say, well, look, I'm trying to design a building, and this is the parameters of the building. Here's the square footage. Here's a plot of land. Like, can you give me some ideas for what I could put on this space? And have it just do it without having to give it a very long prompt yourself, saying, you are an architect and you are doing the following, and please provide, please provide your output in the form of a blueprint, and please, you won't have to do all that prompting. I think, we're going to have software firms that will have figured out, through the design of specific user interfaces, how best to do this.
Yeah, for sure. The switching gears a little bit, you talked a lot about sort of AI's impact on war. And war is always an interesting use case. It's one of the things that sort of pushes technology forward. It shows the limits of what it can do. In your case, what you stated was that there's a theory that AI will push us faster towards total war. Can you tell us what total war is, first of all, and then talk about sort of why that would be the case?
Yeah. So the idea of total war is a war that involves like all of society, where there is essentially not just one front line, but the home front is involved as well, and you have the entire society kind of mobilized towards the war effort. That's what total war is. So people talk about sort of World War II was probably the last total war that the U.S. experienced, where and what Ukraine is going through right now, for instance, is for Ukraine sort of total war. But it's very different than what we saw in like Iraq or Afghanistan, which were very limited kind of regional conflicts where the whole society was not really involved in that conflict, and our industrial base was not completely yoked to producing weapons for that war effort. So why does AI push us more towards total war is interesting. It has to do with the idea that increasingly what is going to be at the front line is going to be weapon systems, that are run by AI software, and that there'll be essentially just fewer boots on the ground at the front line, and therefore fewer targets to kind of effectively hit there. And then the question becomes, well, if you have fewer of these targets to effectively hit on the front line, what can you do? To and the answer is probably to reach further back to the sort of headquarters, and then further back to the homeland of your attacker or your enemy. And I think that dynamic pushes you towards total war faster. And it wouldn't even be like these systems might have autonomy, so there's not even like you're trying to hit the like today you can have drones that are flown from thousands of miles away, and that gives you some if you're fighting an enemy that's flying drones from thousands of miles away, one thing you might think about is trying to hit the center where those operators are. But if you have weapons that have autonomy, there's not even like these operators to hit. Instead, you have to start thinking very quickly about, well, how do I attack the political command and control of my enemy? How do I try to attack my enemy's industrial base so they can't keep building these systems and deploying them to the front line? How do I disrupt the training of future AI models? How do I disrupt the production of chips that they need? So it just pushes you down this direction of hitting targets that are much more remote from the battlefield and towards this kind of total war conception.
I mean, it almost feels from the outside in like that's a bit of what's happening in Israel. That there's both the sort of obviously they're deploying robots and drones at the front lines, but at the same time, they're taking out leaders of Hezbollah in different territories. They're pushing in very aggressively. It feels like there's a lot of game theory going on in the background where they're sort of playing out multi-part games, and they're obviously flying now, fighting on multiple fronts. Does that seem like a reasonable interpretation in that context, or not quite what you're talking about?
I think that's not quite what I'm talking about. Although it's interesting to the extent that Israel is thinking about what is, if it's Hezbollah or Hamas, what are their supply chains, and how can we degrade those as much as possible. But I don't think. And it also is true that they were, to some extent, because of certainly with Hamas, I think they ran out of, kind of military targets to some extent quickly. And then they started to have to look at, they also wanted to take out Hamas's political leadership. But I don't know, that also, I think, had to do with the unique circumstance of that conflict and the sense that the Israelis felt they were facing this very existential threat. And therefore, they really wanted to sort of completely demolish, and I think they even said that was their stated goal in with regard to Hamas was the complete elimination of the organization. So that, of course, pushes you towards attacking the political leaders. What I'm talking about would be different. I think it would be due not to the political aim being the total dismantling of the enemy at the outset. It would just be kind of the consequence of not having a human enemy to strike at the front line would just kind of, and facing all these automated weaponry would just push you further and further down the path of going after supply chains and going after political headquarters, because that would be the only way you could have a human impact that might end the war. Otherwise, you're just facing these automated systems on the battlefield, and the enemy might not care very much if you destroy a few of them, as long as they have more that they can bring to bear.
Yeah, so you have to go to the source in order to be able to
right.
to address the conflict from the outset. Two future-facing questions, one of which is like totally within domain, the other one of which is maybe more subjective. You talk to a lot of people. Everybody talks about sort of AGI. You mentioned sort of ASI, the singularity. Like when do we see those things? What's the range? Is it like 3 years, or is it more like self-driving cars, which we thought we were going to get decade or a while ago, and now just always seems 10 years away?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably more like self-driving cars, to be honest. I don't think we're that close to AGI. I think, in the next 5 years, which is really the timeline I was kind of looking at in the book, I don't think we're going to achieve AGI. But there are people I talk to at the leading labs who are absolutely convinced it's within certainly possible within 5 years. Some of them are absolutely convinced it will happen within 5 years. Some even think within 2 to 3 years, it's quite possible. And part of the problem is we haven't defined AGI that well, and so it becomes a bit of a moving target. And people have different ideas about what's required. And I would think that an AGI, something that actually equals human level intelligence, even for the average person, uh, would have to have a certain efficiency of learning, and that's something that these systems don't have, and doesn't seem to really be on the horizon. The systems still need to be fed tons and tons and tons of data in the pre-training until they get to the point at which, yes, you can do a kind of zero shot example once they've been trained, but the actual training involves the exposure of the system to many, many more examples than a person would need to kind of learn a subject. And I think that is that kind of lack of learning efficiency is one of the problems with the current technology, and something we would have to solve to kind of get to AGI. And then ASI, which is artificial superintelligence, is based on the idea that once you get to AGI, you could have this intelligence explosion where the system starts to self-improve at a dramatic rate, and you get this kind of exponential takeoff. Again, I don't really see that happening anytime soon. I actually think it will be much more like self-driving cars. But the interesting thing about self-driving cars is not that that we don't have widely deployed self-driving cars yet. It's more that what we do have, though, is increasing levels of driver assistance that are getting us, by baby steps, ever closer to self-driving. And I'm pretty convinced, since we have self-driving cars already in a few places, we probably will have, self-driving cars eventually in a lot more places. And we're also going to have much more powerful driver assistance, so that maybe in good weather, most of us don't have to worry too much about driving. And then, yeah, if it rains, we still have to know how to drive, because if it rains, we're going to have to drive or something. But, I think it's going to be a lot like that with these systems, where they will be a kind of copilot technology that will provide a kind of gradually creeping level of autonomy. But we're going to get more and more powerful models, but they're not, because of things like hallucination rates. I think they're not going to be in a position to totally replace us anytime soon, and we'll just get sort of more and more assistance with things and more sophisticated assistance and more accurate assistance, kind of gradually over time. And eventually we may achieve AGI. I think AGI is probably possible. I just think it's not imminent.
So this has been a really fun conversation, and I know I super enjoyed it. We haven't though talked a lot about your day job, which is to work at Fortune.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about your editorial strategy there as far as AI is concerned. What are you excited about covering? Where do you expect to spend more of your time and energy and focus? Because I think that's going to be super instructive for our listeners who are interested in where the puck is going.
Yeah, well, I'm very interested to see what happens with the rollout of more and more reasoning capabilities. I'm interested to see who matches kind of OpenAI's O1 model and what that looks like. There's all these agentic AI systems that are going to be rolled out in the next 2 years. I'm very interested in what happens with those, and some of the issues around how those systems are actually going to really discern human intent. When are they going to, how is that going to work? That interaction of when you send a system out to do something for you. I think I'm pretty sure within the next 2 years, we'll have something where if I want to go on vacation, I can just say to my AI assistant, "Oh, I want to take a vacation to Rome. Go out and research some options and book my holiday for me." The question will be, it might come back and be like, "Oh, great! I've booked you this holiday. You've got first class tickets to Rome, and I've got you in this 5-star hotel, and it's $1,000 a night. I hope that's okay because I already paid for it." And and then the user is going to be like, "Wait a second, I didn't want you to do that." And I think the question is
unless you're Eric Adams.
Unless you're Eric Adams, exactly. Then it's fine, and somebody else is paying for it, so it's all okay. But it's it's going to be this issue of how do we prevent systems from doing that? What are the steps that the vendors that are creating these agents have architected in? so that we can be sure that they followed human intent. But at the same time, there's this, you don't want it to have to constantly come back to you and say, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? Because that'll get annoying. So there's this kind of interesting trade-off between, usability and risk that I think, we're going to have to negotiate with these agents. So that's something I'm definitely watching. I am watching, like, is there some dark horse, completely different type of deep learning or even different, fundamental architecture that's going to kind of come out of nowhere and potentially displace the current models. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but there are some interesting kind of inklings of other things at the margins, and it'll be interesting to see if one of those emerges. And so that's something I'm watching. Regulation is another area that's super fascinating, and we're keeping very close eye on it, fortunately.
Really cool. Well, Jeremy, this has been a whirlwind, and I was super excited coming in, and I'm just as excited getting out. It's great to get your knowledge to all of our listeners, and also just to get the perspective. It's really helpful, and it's fun to watch you sort of do what you do. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Thanks, Satyen.